Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Abdulrazak Gurnah attained a new level of global prominence last year when the Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize for Literature. In awarding the prize to the first black writer to win since Toni Morrison in 1993, the 2021 Nobel Committee hailed Gurnah's work as the uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. Gurnah's new novel, Afterlives, spotlights a critically overlooked historical period, the devastating German colonial rule of early 20th century East Africa and its aftermath, and in the process illuminates a legacy of dislocation that is very much with us today. We are honored to welcome Abdulrazak Gurnah to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us. What a delight to have you.
What a pleasure to be there. Thank you.
For many of us, it was frustrating because you win the Nobel Prize and your books are difficult to come by in the United States. Now this novel comes out. What is that like to have those doors open and have your work go to a whole new audience?
Yeah, well, it's great. It's wonderful for that to happen. I would have thought it would be not uncommon for somebody who's been awarded this fantastic prize, if, for example, that person is not already being spoken of by a journalist as the next winner, the next winner, the next winner. You know, every year there is this kind of short list of people. This year it'll be so-and-so, so-and-so. Very often it isn't, and very often it's a surprise. So when that surprise happens, I would imagine it's quite common that writers' books are unavailable because most writers don't actually have tons of their books sitting in a bookshop somewhere. But it's lovely to be in a position where now the books are available, and available not only in the United States, of course, because of the nature of the global nature of the Nobel Prize. They're also appearing in many different languages in various parts of the world as well, which is incredible.
Your British editor said it has been one of the great sadnesses and frustrations of my career that his work has not received the recognition it deserves. I had almost given up hope. Did you feel that you had the recognition that felt right to you even prior to the Nobel?
Yeah, I thought I was doing okay. I thought I was doing all right. I had readers, after all, the 10th novel, and I knew I had readers in various parts of the world, and I was quite okay with that. Of course, what Alexandra means, my editor means, is that she very kindly thought I deserved greater recognition than the recognition I was receiving. It's not to say that I was a neglected writer. It's just that, she thought more people needed to read my books, and so did the Swedish Academy. So I think the two of them, I'm very grateful to them for having these thoughts, because it has made a big difference. Absolutely, essentially, not just, as I mentioned, not just in the United States, but everywhere. I mean, not in so many places in the world. It's quite astonishing that people not only want to read or hear about the book. Previously, they would have had to read the book in English. Apart from a handful of translations, there were mostly European and Turkish. But now there will be many, many, many more. There will be and want to read those books in their own languages, which is really quite amazing. I really love this idea that people not only want to read books, but they don't, even if when they can read in English as well, but they also want to read books in their own language. And I have people who tell me that they, let's say, a German copy and an English copy, and they read both. I think this is just an amazing interest that people can do that.
They may just be showing off at that point, I think.
They may be, but that's okay. I don't mind. I don't mind.
You said at the time of the prize, the idea that a writer represents, I resist. I represent me. I represent me in terms of what I think and what I am, what concerns me, what I want to write about. And I assume this novel is no exception to that. That's the greatest gift a writer can have, right? To have that blank page and to create what the artist wants to create.
Yeah, sure. But those are two different things. One thing about being able to, or of course, it can be extremely intimidating hearing that blank page in front of you, unless you really are driven, or unless you have the capacity to just produce drivel, which a lot of people can have to. You have a, you know what I mean. You have a deadline.
Right.
You have to say something about blah blah blah, and you say it. That's a different thing. I mean, that make easy come, easy go. That's a report you're doing for because you work that way. But if you're writing a book, which nobody actually has asked you to do, you're doing it. You want to do it, and you want to do it so that it's something that is lasting and valuable, at least for a year or two anyway. You want to make sure you do it right, and you do it so that it has that capacity for engaging a reader and all of those things. So the blank page, in that sense, can be quite a frightening thing. What do I tell them? You know, so that's one thing. The other part of the question, which I think was to do with representing, I think what I had in mind there when I was refusing that, because sometimes when you read, I think that was the New York Times profile that you're referring to. Sometimes when you read something like that, you don't see the question to which that is the answer. So it looks as if I'm saying I do not represent anything but myself.
Mm.
Whereas what I'm saying is that I'm not on a platform to speak for anybody else. I'm not, like a kind of a enlarger of another position. What I speak for is what I think, rather than that I speak for a position that other people share. If they share it, I'm happy. I don't, as well, require anybody else to be behind me. I speak for what I believe in.
Is that a more nuanced way of saying that you write for yourself more than an audience?
No, no, it's not at all. It's to say that I do not want what I say to be seen as ventriloquizing other people's
Mm.
positions. I do not represent anybody else but myself. But it's almost certain that what I'm talking about is shared by other people. So I prefer the word. I prefer to be sort of as sharing a position with other people rather than representing a position.
Afterlives is the name of the new novel by Abdulrazak Gurnah. It is just out from Riverhead. What were the origins of this historical novel, of what you wanted to write, and ultimately why you wanted to write about the war between Britain and Germany in East Africa?
So it's always interested me because I grew up there. I grew up in that part of the world. My grandfather, well, kind of my grandfather, because we are very generous with the way we speak about our relatives. He
Mm-hmm.
was really my mother's uncle. But, we speak of our cousins as our brothers and our mother's uncles as our grandfathers. But anyway, he was conscripted into the German colonial army as a carrier. Carriers were the roads were not good enough to support trucks or even carts in any big way. So really the armies depended on human carriers. So each of these, the fighting force would have uh, with it a huge number of people carrying the personal belongings and the military materials and so on. So he was conscripted as one of those. I expect he deserted very quickly because he was that kind of person. I don't
Mm.
think it would have kept him for long. But he used to talk about the war. Other people used to talk about that war. This was in the mid 1950s, so it was several years before, but they were still alive. These are people who went through that experience. So they were still talking about that and the ferocity of the war, the cruelty of it, and so on. So that was always there from my childhood as well, hearing these stories. And it's so close, it's nearby. And always intriguing, the idea that we grew up with the British overloading us, but to think that the Germans were here before. And this is their story, the story of this. Long before I heard anything about the Second World War and the Holocaust, I knew something about the ferocity of the German military from these stories. So for a long time, I've been wanting to write about that episode, especially because I couldn't find anything very much written about it. So it seemed that that was something, not just out of a kind of opportunity sense, but just something I wanted to understand a little bit more about. When I started to write Paradise, which was published in 1994, I had in mind to write about that episode, that war. So, what is in fact the final paragraph, the final episode in Paradise, was the first thing I wrote, that recruitment drive. But I couldn't, at that time, I didn't really know enough to about that time and to do that. And in any case, I became intrigued by other things, like how did this 18-year-old get to the point where he would want to do such a thing as join the German colonial army. So I was interested in the story as what had brought him to that point, and other things. Anyway, the book was published in 1994. I wrote other things, moved on, learned a lot, taught, read. So when so many years later, I thought, now I think I can write that book about the war.
You were interested in beginning with the story of Hamza. This is a young man who joins up, who becomes a soldier in the colonial army, and this is really the core of the story. And what is it about Hamza that takes us through so that we understand what he is going through and the journey that he ultimately takes to go in and then ultimately to leave and to return to whatever lies ahead?
Well, I had in mind somebody as, so I wasn't thinking of Yusuf as Hamza, but I was thinking of Hamza as somebody like Yusuf. There must have been more than one Yusuf. Yusuf was not unique, or could not have been unique. So I wanted that sort of ideal, somebody who had foolishly made this choice, but who actually is not suited to the kind of abrasive, cruel, cynical, whatever it is of life of being a mercenary. So that's one thing. I wanted to find him in difficulties emotionally, as well as being able to actually not perform the soldiery task that would be required of him. So I wanted that kind of how should I put it? How can I put it without making him sound like a foolish boy? I wanted that kind of tenderness, that gentleness, that capacity for just taking things in. A kind of, it might seem like passivity, but I don't think of it as passivity. I think of it as a kind of calmness that would allow somebody to cope with unpleasant circumstances until things, keeping an eye open, keeping an ear open, and hoping for the best kind of thing. Just seeing how can I get out of this, which is what essentially I hope I've done with Hamza and with Yusuf. That these are people who have no defenses aside from their intelligence and their capacity for just keeping an eye open and looking after themselves.
There is Khalifa as well, who really becomes a mentor and someone who gives us another point of view, right? Another idea.
Absolutely, he was very important in my thinking of this. So this is somebody who not only rescues Afia, of course, and looks after her, but also in his own grumbling, gruff way, is the one who recognizes what I'm describing about someone like Hamza or Yusuf, that he recognizes a certain kind of vulnerability, but also a kind of intelligence. You can see that this is not, you can see this is a traumatized, wounded person, but he's not just a kind of a boorish bullshit or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he extends that protective welcome. Come, I've got a little room there that I don't use. It's safe enough. You can't, even if you're a difficult person, you can't come bothering us. Go sleep in there. I can imagine my father doing something like that.
Abdulrazak Gurnah is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new novel is Afterlives. It is published by Riverhead Books. This idea of fighting in those wars in Africa, and as you write about it in this novel, it's Africans fighting other Africans for this side or that side, and that's often I mean, as complicated as war is to figure out in general, that makes it even more difficult and a head scratcher, doesn't it?
Yeah, although we are familiar with that in other contexts, this is an earlier, much earlier version of what we also see happening now, where you have what essentially are mercenary armies, or even if they are employed by by the state, but if the state is a patron state, take Afghanistan, you know, the Afghan army melts in front of the Taliban because it's not really an army, it's not really a state army. They go away because what is it they're fighting for? They're, in a sense, mercenaries of the state rather than soldiers of the state. But this is a later development. That earlier development was, if you think about it, the combatants involved in that war were really European nations, not really, they were European nations fighting out there, whatever it is, in this location. On the one hand, you have the German Dutch West Africa, and you have the Kenya colony, and then you have Mozambique, which at that time was called something Portuguese Oriental, and you have the Belgians on the other side in Rwanda and Burundi and the Congo. And all of them had African mercenaries. The question then is, what were these people doing? Why did uh, African people join these colonial armies, especially when they actually end up fighting each other? And they did. They killed each other happily. And indeed, even more than that, the British contingent actually included Gold Coast and Nigerian contingents, which were brought over, especially from West Africa, to join in the fight against these other Africans. It's a great irony that so many African people were fighting against each other, essentially to decide which of them is going to be their colonizer. Because whoever won that war is going to be the colonizing power. So
Hmm.
how did that happen? That's one of the things, one of the questions I was asking myself as I was writing this book. How did such a thing happen? Or why is it that they didn't say, hey, let's stop doing this, we're killing each other? I suppose partly it's because they didn't think they were killing each other in the first place. In the first place, that idea of an African identity was not there yet. People thought of themselves as whoever they are, Kikuyu or Hehe or Nubian or whatever it is. So they weren't fighting against other Africans, they were fighting against whoever it was who was on the other side, Bakongo or whatever it is. So that notion of an African identity wasn't with us yet. And I guess the other thing, why in the first place would you join a colonial army? I guess, again, you know, these are just guesses on my part, that it would be the prestige of the conqueror. This is the most powerful force here. And possibly many of those would be young people who want a little bit of that prestige too, or a little bit of the adventure, maybe suggested by joining yourself. Or it could be the uniform, it could be the money, or rather, it could be all of these things. But I would have thought the prestige of a new force, new armaments, new technology, the kind of status it will give you in your own, you could say, you could go to people and say, do what I say, and that kind of thing. I expect this would also have played its part. And no doubt coercion would have been part of it as well. It was quite common, how should I say, it was quite a common practice anyway, for colonial administration to go to the big man, as it were, in a community or village or whatever, and say, right, I want 10 from you,
Hmm.
whether it might be to build a road, or it might be, I want 10 conscripts. I want 10 from you otherwise. And the otherwise could be many things. It could be loss of this, it could be loss of that, it could be, you know, loss of status for the boss man or whoever. Anyway, so some of them would have been volunteered in this way by their own elders, by their own communities. all of these would have ended up there in that mix.
Well, something you just touched on that I find fascinating is that the power and the attraction of the victor, the conquered joining the conqueror because of that prestige.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what happened. Because in the example of Gold Coast Africa, and it connects with my earlier point about an African identity. What made colonialism possible in our part of the world is because the Germans could actually have, they could first knock out the Albushiri, which was the coastal people. They could then turn around to the people in the mountain region, the Ameru, but there was no national resistance, as it were. So they could deal with these. They fought war after war after war after war, but they're all local wars. So they could deal with this one and then turn around, deal with that one, and turn around, deal with that one. Eventually, the ones that gave them trouble were the Wahehe and then the Majimaji rebellion from the south, which is still the Wahehe area, later in the early 20th century. But what happened, and it happens all the time, or has historically happened all the time.
Hmm.
You think of the Romans and the Gauls, the Romans and the Huns, the Romans and the Germans, whatever, is that the conquered then become the mercenary force of the conqueror. So the once the conquered have actually submitted, they're then offered jobs and become part of the conquering army that then attacks the next group of people. So although the original German colonizing mercenary force was Nubian and Sudanese, in other words, entirely out of that area, the British were very good at this in bringing people from totally different places to fight, because then that way there were no divided loyalties. You see what I mean?
Hmm.
So you get Indians to fight in Africa, you get Nepalese to fight in, I don't know, Fiji or something like that, because then there are no divided loyalties. So they bring these Sudanese Nubian people to as the original Schutztrooper, but they didn't bring any more, as those were kind of getting whittled down, as it were, with fighting. They could then recruit locally because the conquered people now wanted to be part of the conquering force as they fight the next neighbor, the next enemy. So everybody becomes complicit in this way. And the same is true of the British King's African Rifles, as we spoke. They too would recruit first mercenaries from elsewhere, and then they recruit locally, because now the army has prestige. You get that lovely uniform. You can strut around. You can shout at people. Everybody's scared of you.
Mm. Let me end with this, and that is a line from the novel that so struck me. At one point, when Hamza is asked about his past, he says, "You want me to tell you about myself as if I have a complete story, but all I have are fragments that are snagged by troubling gaps." The way you put that together is so astonishing and beautiful. And I was interested just in writing that line if you think of it that way.
Yeah, well, I think of it that way, and I've been thinking about it like that for, I mean, in several of my books. This is this idea that we never have complete stories, and not only that, but that in fact what we do have are only little pieces that we can't kind of quite digest, as it were, quite get rid of, and so they remain. That's the snag word there. They're
Mm.
the ones that snag on our memories and our minds, the ones that we can't quite sort of homogenize and liquidize and put away somewhere. And they're the ones that become our stories. They're the ones that we don't know how to put away, I suppose. Otherwise, our stories are like everybody else's.
Does the writing of this novel and of previous novels help you in identifying and understanding your own fragments?
Well, it helps me to keep probing it. It
Mm.
helps me to keep kind of trying to dig them out from wherever it is. And writers are impossible. They never forget things. They keep digging things out, like dentists. They keep finding little broken bits and saying, "What is that? What is this?" So I don't know about understanding, but I think it's just a way of saying, what have I found here? How can I talk about this? How can I contemplate this?
Perhaps I'm making more of this than I should, but at the moment, it's almost more fascinating to contemplate it than it is to fully understand it.
Uh, well, for a start, I don't think you can fully understand it.
Right.
So I think that's why I keep writing, because you always think, when you think you've got the hang of something, then you think, well, I didn't think of that other dimension of it. Like I was just saying to you, I had not, until I started writing this book or thinking about this book, which is quite a while before I started writing, I hadn't thought about, why did people join up in a way that we were discussing a moment ago. It couldn't possibly have been just stupid or treacherous or greedy or something like that. I know that because my uncle, I mentioned my grandfather, but I know that my uncle, my mother's brother, joined the British Army during the Second World War when he was 18 years old. And for years he had this photograph, studio photograph of himself taken in his new uniform, which used to sit in our house, not in his house, but in our house. As that was Uncle Shebe, as you know, when he joined up. I think, why join up? But it's not something I thought about in any deep way. I remember even asking him, why did you join up? And he just laughed. You know how people do? You just avoid the question by just
Right.
laughing it off. So he just laughed. So I never quite knew. So I had to think it through myself. But I still don't know if I have an answer.
Abdulrazak Gurnah is a professor emeritus of English and post-colonial literatures at the University of Kent. The name of the new novel is Afterlives. It is published by Riverhead Books. Abdulrazak Gurnah, it's a great honor to have you on our program. I thank you so much for being with us. What a great pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org, and you can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us